The sun was merciless that morning, blazing high over the dusty plains of Dry Creek. It pressed down like a blacksmith's hammer, heating the earth until the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight. Riding along the trail that led into town, Eli Rollins tugged his hat lower against the glare. His eyes narrowed in the kind of squint that came from too many summers beneath the western sky. His horse's hooves stirred up puffs of reddish dust, each step sending the powder into the air, coating his boots, his chaps, even the rough stubble on his jaw. Eli looked every bit the tired rancher. His leather gear was worn smooth from use, his once blue shirt bleached pale by sun and time. He hadn't shaved in days, the beginnings of a beard shadowing his face. He'd been riding since first light, 30, maybe 40 miles south from his spread, all for a few sacks of feed. The drought had been cruel this year, crueler than most. His horses needed barley, and no amount of wishing would make it appear on his ranch. And so, much as he disliked it, town was the only answer. Dry Creek was the last place Eli ever wanted to be. The town appeared on the horizon like a graveyard of old bones scattered across the desert floor. Buildings with false fronts leaned against the heat, their signs faded and peeling. The sound of flies buzzed lazily in the still air, broken only by the occasional whinny of a horse tied up outside. The smell of dust, manure, and sour whiskey drifted on the breeze. As if the place itself had forgotten how to breathe fresh air. Eli rode down the main street, past the saloon, past the livery, until he reached Morrison's general store. He swung down from the saddle, patting his horse's neck with a quiet word of comfort. "Won't be long, boy." Tying the reins to the hitching post, he stretched his back and stepped up onto the boardwalk. The store's door creaked open on rusty hinges. Inside, the heat gave way to shade, though the air felt heavy, thick with the smell of kerosene and flour. Shelves crowded with canned goods, bolts of cloth, ammunition, and tools lined the walls. Eli's boots thudded softly against the creaking planks as he made his way toward the counter. Behind it stood Chester Morrison, a man whose round belly and sharper tongue had made him the unofficial gossip of Dry Creek. He was deep in conversation with two ranch hands. Eli recognized Tom Garrett from the Double K Ranch, and a burly fellow named Pike Stevens. Morrison's voice carried, smug and self-important. "Told her last week," he was saying. "No more credit. A woman's got to learn how to manage her affairs better than that." Garrett spat into the brass spittoon by the counter and grinned. "Miriam Harper's been nothing but trouble, even before her husband died." The third man snorted. "Died? That's a generous way of putting it." The words hit Eli wrong, though he kept his expression neutral. He cleared his throat. "Afternoon. Need 3 sacks of barley if you've got them." Morrison looked up, his expression shifting from smug to salesman in the blink of an eye. "Eli Rollins. Haven't seen you in town for a while. 3 sacks, you say? That'll be $12. Eli reached for his wallet, counting out the bills. But before he could finish, the bell above the door chimed. The sound silenced the room. The men turned, their smirks sharpened, and Eli found himself looking at the reason for their cruel talk. A woman entered the store, and for a moment Eli wondered if he'd walked into a scene from a different story. She was younger than he'd expected, given the venom in their voices, no more than 25. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her dress plain calico, faded from too many washings. But there was something about the way she carried herself that held Eli's attention. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, as if daring the world to break her spirit. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I need flour, salt, and a tin of lard, please." The smile drained from Morrison's face. "Cash up front, Mrs. Harper. Told you before. I understand." She pulled a small purse from her pocket, setting a few coins on the counter. Eli could see from where he stood it wasn't enough. Not nearly. Morrison counted them slowly, each clink of metal loud in the hushed store. This'll cover half a sack of flour and maybe some salt. No lard. Color crept into her cheeks, but her voice stayed even. Then I'll take what it will cover. Garrett leaned against the counter, his voice oily. Maybe you ought to think about other ways of making money. Widow woman's got to get by somehow. Miriam Harper turned to face him, and Eli caught the flash of fire in her eyes. I manage honestly, Mr. Garrett, which is more than some can say. Honest women don't poison their husbands, Stevens muttered, loud enough for all to hear. The words hung heavy, cruel and deliberate. Eli saw Miriam's hand tremble as she turned back to the counter, but her voice did not falter. My flour and salt, please, Mr. Morrison. Morrison smirked, holding the coins up to the light. Actually, looking at this again, I don't think it even covers that. Prices have gone up, you see. Maybe this buys you a cup of flour, if that. That was enough. Eli stepped forward, pulling $2 silver from his pocket and laying them flat on the counter. The coins rang against the wood. Add what the lady needs to my order. The store went quiet. Miriam turned, her dark eyes wide, pride and desperation pouring across her face. Up close, Eli noticed the careful stitches on her dress, the scuffed boots, the hollows under her cheekbones that spoke of missed meals. I can't accept, she began. Not accepting anything, Eli said firmly, his gaze fixed on Morrison. Store made an error last time I was here. This squares us up. Isn't that right? For a moment, Morrison blustered. But Eli Rollins wasn't a man to trifle with. His reputation as good with his fists and his gun was well earned. Morrison flushed and nodded reluctantly. If you say so. Eli tipped his hat to Miriam. Ma'am, you go ahead and tell him what else you need. She hesitated, searching his face as if waiting for the catch, for the unspoken price that kindness often carried. Eli knew that look. He'd seen it on wounded animals, creatures that learned too well that generosity often came with teeth. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Flour, salt, lard, and a small bag of sugar, if it's not too much. For my daughter. Whatever you need, Eli said simply. Then he turned away, giving her the dignity of not being watched as she completed her order. Behind him, the silence stretched. He could feel the stares of the other men, could sense the judgment hanging heavy in the air. He'd marked himself by standing with her, aligned himself with the town's pariah. So be it. Eli had never cared much for the opinions of men who kicked those already down. When Miriam gathered her packages, she paused beside him. Her voice was soft but clear. Thank you. I'll repay you somehow. Eli tipped his hat again. No need. She studied him for a heartbeat, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Then she nodded, gathered her things, and walked out with her head high despite the weight she carried. Through the window, Eli watched her cross the street, dignity in every step. He knew then what the others refused to see. Miriam Harper was not what they claimed. She was something else entirely stronger, braver. Whatever her story was, he found himself wanting to know it. And in that moment, Eli Rollins realized that this trip to town, meant only for barley, was about to change far more than he'd planned. Eli told himself he was just curious, that he didn't care where Miriam Harper went after Morrison's store or how she scraped by, in a town that would rather see her starve than spend a kind word on her. He loaded his barley, checked his cinch twice, and even stopped by the blacksmith to have a loose shoe reset, everything a reasonable man would do on a routine supply trip. But when the sun slid west and painted Dry Creek in copper light, his horse took the long way out of town. Hooves turning toward the rows of tired shacks slumped along the eastern edge. He didn't prod the animal to change course. Truth be told, he'd already decided. He found the place easily enough. A sagging porch, a roof patched with whatever scrap wood could be scavenged, a yard more dirt than anything else. The fence leaned like a drunk, trying to stand straight against the wind. But the worst thing wasn't the house, it was the silence. The kind that sinks into the boards and settles in a child's bones. A small figure sat on the steps, knees pulled up beneath a faded skirt, a rag doll clutched tight. She had her mother's dark hair, and that same watchful look that said she'd learned to measure a person before offering trust. When she spotted Eli, she didn't run, didn't smile, just stared with solemn eyes. Eli tipped his hat. "Afternoon, miss." She nodded, no more than that. He rode on, but the picture stuck with him all the way back to the ranch. A lonely house, a wary child, and the woman who carried herself like the world could shove her, and she'd still refuse to bend. 2 sunrises later, he was on that road again. He'd told himself it was because he had extra seed, corn, and beans, and the bags were just gathering dust in the barn. Waste was a sin out here, his mother used to say. Besides, he rationed. A few pointers on saving water in bad soil wouldn't hurt anyone. The lies might have comforted him if he'd believed a word of them. The Harper place looked worse by daylight. The garden was a graveyard of last year's hope-stunted stalks, baked earth cracking like old pottery. Eli swung down at the gate, tied his horse to a post that probably should have given up standing years ago, and climbed the porch steps. The door opened before he could knock. Miriam Harper stood in the frame with a kitchen knife clutched white-knuckled in her hand. For a second suspicion flared in her eyes, sharp as the steel. Then she recognized him. "Mr. Rollins," she said carefully. "Eli," he corrected, lifting the small sacks. "Got some seed that'll go to waste if I keep it. Figured your plot might have better use for it than my barn." "You figured the poor widow needed charity?" The knife didn't lower. "I figured dry ground deserves one more try with good seed," he said, steady. "And a woman willing to fight for it deserves a little help doing the planting." They stood there a long breath, measuring each other like 2 wary strays, deciding if the other would bite. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, the careful mending on her sleeves, the pride that stitched her spine straight. Behind her, the little girl peered from a doorway, doll tucked under one arm. At last, Miriam stepped back and moved the knife away from center. "I suppose you'd better come in." Inside was sparse, but clean a table with 3 mismatched chairs. A wood stove patched more times than made sense, shelves with a few chipped plates, and, neatly lined, the supplies he'd helped her buy. Everything said the same thing in 100 small ways. "We don't have much, but what we have we keep decent." "Sarah," Miriam called, gentler now. "We have a guest." The child appeared, gave the smallest of curtsies that nearly broke Eli's heart, and stood like a soldier beside her mother. "Can I get you water?" Miriam asked, and he heard what it cost her to offer it, when water meant work and scarcity and counting every cup. "I'm right," he said. "Thought we might take a look at your garden." He held up the sacks. "I've got ideas about making a little go a long way." Miriam set the knife on the table, and Eli noticed her hands shake once before she willed them steady. The question in the room was too loud not to answer. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you here, Eli Rollins? What do you want from us?" He could have said he needed to balance accounts, that a man's conscience kicks up dust if he lets it. But all that came out was the simple truth he could bear. "My ma said good seed shouldn't go to waste. You look like someone still planting." It wasn't an answer so much as a truce. She nodded once. "Then let's see the garden." They went out into the hard light. He walked her rows, kneeling to crumble soil in his hand, showing her how to dig deeper and mound the earth so the night air could help keep what little moisture they managed. He taught her to scoop shallow basins, berms. He called them to gather the smallest cloudbursts, and to mulch with whatever she could find, old straw, leaves, even torn burlap sacks. Sarah followed silently, apron gathered like a basket, carrying seed as though the future itself had been counted out into her small hands. They worked until the heat started to wobble the edges of the world. Eli noticed Miriam hiding her weariness, the way she paused when she thought he wasn't looking, how hunger had carved careful hollows into her cheeks. He'd seen a lot of tough in his time. This was the rare, kind silent. "That's enough for today," he said at last. "Let the soil settle. Water after sundown small and slow. You'll lose less to the sky that way." She wiped the back of her wrist across her forehead, leaving a streak of dust. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed. Neighbors ought to look out for each other." She laughed a small, bitter sound. "I've yet to meet a neighbor who thinks I'm worth the trouble." Before he could answer, the child stepped forward and tugged lightly at his vest. "Mr. Cowboy?" she asked, grave as a judge. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" Miriam flushed, mortified. "Sarah," Eli crouched so his eyes met the girl's. "I try to be a good one," he said honestly. "Some days I fail, but I keep trying." "Why do you ask?" "Because Mama says good men don't hurt little girls, and the men in town say bad things to Mama. They're supposed to be good." The logic lodged like a thorn. He nodded solemnly. "Sometimes folks get mixed up about what's good and what's not. They listen to stories instead of looking at the truth right in front of them." He glanced up at Miriam. "Your Mama's a good woman. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah seemed to weigh this, then surprised him with a fierce, quick hug before darting back to her mother's side. He tipped his hat and made for his horse. "I'll come back in a few days. See how the seedlings are doing." Miriam started to protest, pride rising like a shield, but the words snagged on something softer. She settled for, "We'll manage." "No, you will," he said, and rode off with the feeling of a pair of thin arms still around his neck. That night the sky tore itself open. Lightning crawled along the black bones of the clouds. Thunder rolled up from the mountains, and rain came in sheets so heavy the desert dirt turned to soup in minutes. Eli stood on his porch, looking into the storm's teeth, and thought about a patched roof and gaps between gourds you could see daylight through. He told himself it wasn't his problem. And a crack of thunder slammed the house so hard the window glass rattled like loose dice. And he was already moving. He threw a saddle on his horse without a lantern. You couldn't keep one lit in that wind, and rode blind toward the memory of a leaning fence and a stubborn woman's chin. The road was a river. The rain stung his face, and the world was reduced to the feel of a familiar horse under him, and the prayer that he'd kept his direction straight. He heard the child crying before he saw the house. A high knifing sound that cut through the storm. It was the sound that made him kick the door in without. Bothering to knock out water poured through 3 holes. In the roof and another where the wood had surrendered altogether. The floor was a shallow pond. Miriam, hair down, sleeves shoved to the elbows, was hustling pots and buckets under the worst of the leaks, losing the battle inch by inch. Sarah balanced on a chair with her doll, small hands clamped white on the backrest. Eyes enormous. "Let me help," Eli said, raising his voice over the roar. For a split second she just stared at him, and he saw naked. Relief break through everything else before she shoved it down. "The roof's going," she said unnecessarily. "Then we're leaving." His voice went brisk. "Grab what you can save, blankets, clothes, food. We'll make for the barn." "Barn's barely standing," she protested. "Better than this." "We don't have time to argue." She nodded. They moved quick Miriam, bundling what mattered, Sarah clutching her doll, and a tin of biscuits. Eli scooping the child up with one arm and shouldering a sack with the other. They splashed into the night and fought their way through wind that tried to shove them backward. The barn groaned but held. Inside, the smell of hay and animals was blessedly solid. Eli set Sarah down and worked like a man with a job he understood, kicking straw into a dryish corner, shifting bales to block the wind slicing through the gaps, finding an old metal bucket and coaxing a mean little fire to life with shavings and patience. The warmth was thin, but it was something. Miriam sank down with Sarah tucked into her lap. Both of them shivered. Eli shrugged out of his coat damp, but warm with his body heat, and draped it around them. "I can't take that," Miriam started. "You can," he said, not unkindly. "Child's cold." They sat like that, of a storm hammered the world around them. Sarah's sobs softened to hiccups, then sleep. The barn creaked, but stayed upright. Eli kept the tiny fire fed, kept watch. A man and a widow in a barn at night would start talk big enough to fill Dry Creek twice over. Let it? Talk didn't keep a roof from collapsing. "It's gone, isn't it?" she said into the hush between thunder rolls. "The house." "Roof, sure," he said. "Walls are still standing. Walls can be fixed. With what money?" She laughed once, flat and humorless. "I spent my last coins in town. We'll figure something out." "We?" She looked up, eyes searching his. "There's no we, Mr. Rollins. You've been kind. Kinder than anyone. But this isn't your problem." "Maybe not," he said. "I'm making it mine anyway. Why?" The word cracked, a mixture of anger and fear. He stared into the weak flame a long moment. The truth he usually kept buried rose anyway. "My brother," he said quietly. 5 years back. Rustlers set an ambush on the ridge north of my place. I was supposed to ride with him that day, but I'd gone to town instead. Cards, whiskey, fool's errands. He swallowed. By the time I got home, he was dying. I held him while he went. Decided after that I wasn't going to stand aside and let bad things happen just because it was easier not to get involved. Miriam said nothing. A fire popped. She flinched and then sat very still. Sarah's small breath patted at her shoulder. "I don't want to be anyone's penance," she said at last. "You're not," Eli answered. "You're just someone who needs help. And I've got 2 hands." He stared at the door, where the rain sheeted through the cracks. "And a stubborn streak." They waited the storm out together, 3 figures tucked into a barn while the world rattled and roared. In the gray wash that passes for dawn after a night like that, Eli stepped out and took stock. The house was a wreck, no use lying about it. But it could be saved. He felt the resolve take root inside him, the way good seed bites into wet dirt. He turned back to the barn. Miriam stood with Sarah wrapped in his coat, both of them looking smaller than they had any right to. That was the moment he knew. He wasn't leaving them to weather Dry Creek alone. The day crawled by heavy with work. He pulled the worst of the ruined shingles, stretched an old tarp to keep off dew, and stacked whatever salvageable boards he could pry loose. Miriam moved like a ghost, steady and efficient, bailing water, laying blankets in the sun, rescuing what little furniture hadn't warped beyond saving. Sarah, her solemn little face set in concentration, carried spoons and books like they were treasures. Around midday, the rhythm was shattered by riders 3 men, horses snorting, hooves kicking mud. Sheriff Watson, skinny and pinched like a man wearing a borrowed badge. Tom Garrett, mouth twisted into what he thought passed for a smile. And Pike Stevens, broad as a hay wagon and twice as mean. "Rollins," the sheriff called, reining up. "Heard you were out here." "Looks that way," Eli said, climbing down from the roof. He kept one hand near his hammer, and not coincidentally, Near the Colt on his belt. Got concerns, Watson went on, gaze sliding past Eli to Miriam. About the propriety of this situation. What situation's that? Eli asked mildly. Garrett snorted. Unmarried man working alone at a widow's place. Folks are talking. Folks in this town always are, Eli said, voice even. Might try using those mouths for something useful. Like asking why no one thought to check if this roof would hold through a storm. Stevens spat, a brown arc in the mud. Decent people don't keep company with murderesses. Miriam stiffened behind him, but before Eli could respond, little footsteps pattered on the porch. Sarah appeared dragging a wet blanket twice her size, stopped dead at the sight of the men, and then did the unthinkable. She smiled politely. Afternoon, Sheriff. Mr. Garrett, Mr. Stevens. Even Garrett shifted in his saddle at that. The sheriff cleared his throat. You helping your mama, little one? Yes, sir. Mr. Eli is fixing our roof. He says I'm a good helper. That's good, Watson muttered, not sounding convinced. Garrett recovered his swagger. Still doesn't look right. You want to play carpenter, Rollins. Do it on your own place. Eli stepped forward, the heat going out of his voice the way it does right before steel goes cold. I'm fixing a roof for a woman and a child who need shelter. If you've got a problem with that, maybe look in your own souls before you go peering into mine. The moment stretched thin as wire. Watson finally tugged his reins. Just be mindful of appearances, Rollins. For everyone's sake. They turned their horses and rode off, leaving a silence full of things unsaid. Miriam's hands trembled when the dust settled. They'll make trouble for you. They already have, he said. Doesn't change the nails that need pounding. By evening, the worst of the roof frame was up. Eli's shoulders ached, his palms were raw despite the calluses, and he'd sweated through his shirt twice. But when he looked at the straight lines of lumber reaching skyward instead of caving in, he felt something like hope climb his ribs. Miriam called them in when the light turned amber. Supper was beans cooked slow with a whisper of salt and a heel of cornbread. He'd eaten better 100 times, but he'd rarely eaten with more gratitude. Sarah perched on a chair, telling him in careful detail how she'd been promoted to nail holder under his supervision. Miriam sat across from him, watching him in that measuring way he was learning to understand. When they finished, she walked him to the gate. The evening air was cool and smelled like wet dust, a good smell, a promise. She hugged herself, not from cold. Please don't come back, she said, the words low, almost ashamed. You've done more than anyone. I won't have you ruined because of us. Eli rested one hand on the gatepost. I'll be here at dawn with lumber and proper tools. We'll set shingles tomorrow. I said, I heard you, he said gently. I'm choosing not to listen. Pride doesn't keep rain off a child's bed. She stared at him, surprise warring with something that looked suspiciously like relief. You're a stubborn man, Eli Rollins. Guilty. He tipped his hat. Try to sleep. We'll need our strength. He left her standing in the yard, with the sky turning violet above her. And for the first time since Dry Creek had decided she was a villain in a story she didn't recognize. Hope took a breath in Miriam Harper's chest. Dawn came pink and clean. Eli arrived with a wagon stacked to the rails boards, nails, a borrowed saw, and a determination that could have roofed a church. Miriam had coffee ready thin, bitter but hot. We start with the ridge, he said, handing her a measuring stick. You hold. I'll cut. We'll teach Sarah to fetch and keep her clear of the edges. They fell into a rhythm that didn't need much talk. She learned quick how to keep a board true, how to test a surface for level with the eye and the pad of a palm, how to brace a beam with her shoulder while he drove home a nail. By noon, Sarah had hammered 3 nails under his watchful eye and wore a pride so bright It felt like another lantern brought into the room. They were finishing the day's last run when Miriam called them in. She'd managed preserves peaches, tart and sweet, and the three of them ate on the porch steps while the sun melted behind the low hills. For a long moment, it felt like a picture from a different life, a family at ease in the cool, telling the small stories of the day. "Mr. Eli?" Sarah asked through a yawn. "Are you going to live here with us now?" Miriam went very still. Eli smiled. "No, little one. I've got my own ranch. But I'll be around until this house is set right." "And after?" Sarah pushed, with a child's simple bravery. "I reckon I'll stop by when I can," he said. "Make sure someone's taking proper care of my fine roof." Sarah nodded, satisfied. When she'd gone inside, Miriam stood beside him at the wagon, hands folded tight. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said, not accusing pleading. "I don't," he said, and it was the truest thing he'd spoken all day. Some things are worth showing up for. She met his gaze, starlight pooling in her eyes. "And what have you decided we are?" He took a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I think a Western love story doesn't always start with hearts and flowers. Sometimes it begins with a tarp, a hammer, and a woman who refuses to be broken." He hesitated. "And a little girl who asks the right questions." The smallest smile touched her mouth, quick and vulnerable. Then, "I'll see you at dawn, Eli." He rode home whistling a tune he hadn't remembered in years, the road ahead clearer than the night around him. Somewhere behind, on a tired porch under a sky full of stars, a woman stood watching the dark where he'd disappeared. For the first time in a long while, she let herself imagine a different ending to the story the town had written for her one with sturdier walls, a dry bed for her child, and a man who kept showing up, no matter the cost. The next mornings came fast, each one stitched with sweat, sawdust, and the kind of silence that meant two people were finding a rhythm they hadn't planned on. Eli brought boards and nails. Miriam brought strong hands and a will that didn't quit. And Sarah trotted in between, proud to be given small jobs nail holder, water fetcher, errand runner doc by the end of the week. The roof stood whole again, shingles sharp against the sun, walls braced, windows patched. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a home. Stubborn and standing, like the woman who kept it. Still, gossip in Dry Creek was louder than a church bell on Sunday that one afternoon. After a long day swinging hammers, Eli rode into town for kerosene and horse liniment. He hadn't even stepped off the boardwalk before the whispers started. "Rollins has lost his mind," one man muttered. "Working day and night for that Harper woman. You know what folks say about her. Poison in her pots, same poison in her bed." Another spat. Eli's jaw tightened. He kept walking, ignoring the sting of their words. But the tension hung heavy in the air dot inside Morrison's store. The talk turned sharper. Morrison leaned across the counter, lowering his voice, but not enough. "You fixing to marry her, Rollins? You're throwing your name away on that kind." Eli set the kerosene on the counter hard enough that the bottle rattled. "Her kind? You mean a woman raising a child on her own and still finding the grit to keep a roof standing?" Morrison flushed. "I'm saying a man ought to think about his reputation." "My reputation's my own," Eli said flatly. "And if this town's got breath to waste on a widow trying to survive, maybe it's not worth listening to." He paid in silence and left. But the fire in his chest burned hotter than the sun on his back. That night, he returned to the Harper place with supplies balanced on his saddle. Miriam was outside, scrubbing clothes in a tub, sleeves rolled up, arms strong with work. Sarah ran circles in the yard with her doll, her laughter bright against the evening. Miriam looked up, reading his face before he spoke. "What did they say this time?" Eli hesitated. "Doesn't matter." "Yes, it does," she said quietly. I hear it every time I walk into town. Every time I ask for credit or just for fair trade. They don't see me as a woman trying to live. They see me as a shadow they can pin their fears on. Her voice cracked, but her back stayed straight. I told myself I didn't care, that I could outlast their whispers. But it's Sarah. She hears things. She's old enough now to understand some of it. And I can't protect her from everything. Eli set the supplies down and stepped closer, his voice low. You're right. You can't protect her from everything. But you can show her what standing tall looks like. You've been doing that every day I've known you. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked it away. And what about you, Eli? You stand beside us long enough, you'll be marked the same? Then let him mark me, he said firmly. I've been called worse than a man who helps a widow and her child. For the first time, the weight in her gaze shifted not suspicion, not defiance, but something softer, something dangerous. The weeks rolled on. Work turned into shared suppers, and shared suppers turned into stories told by firelight. Sarah grew bolder, peppering Eli with questions about horses, the stars, even the scars on his knuckles. Miriam listened, sometimes smiling when she forgot to guard her face. One night, after Sarah had drifted to sleep, Miriam sat on the porch while Eli mended tack by lantern light. The cicadas hummed, the sky spilled with stars. You're a good man? She said suddenly. Eli looked up, startled. Don't know if I'd go that far. I do, she replied, her voice steady. A bad man wouldn't have stayed after the roof was done. A bad man wouldn't give my daughter reason to laugh. He swallowed, looking away toward the horizon. Truth is, I don't know what kind of man I am anymore. I only know I want to be better than I was. And somehow, being here, helping you, it makes me think maybe I can. The silence between them pulsed with something alive. Miriam drew in a slow breath, her hands twisting in her lap. The town won't let this be easy. When has anything worth having been easy? Eli asked. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. But Dry Creek wasn't done testing them. One evening, as Eli rode back from his ranch, dust clouds on the horizon signaled trouble. 4 riders, hard-faced and hungry, drifting too close to the harbor place. He knew the type men who smelled weakness like wolves. He spurred his horse harder. By the time he reached the yard, Miriam stood on the porch, shotgun clutched tight, Sarah behind her skirts. The riders circled, leering. Evenin', Mom, one drawled. Fine night for company. Company's not welcome, Miriam said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Eli swung down, his revolver already drawn. You heard the lady. Move on. The riders sneered, eyes narrowing. Tension coiled tight, the kind that could snap into blood in a heartbeat. Miriam's voice cut through the air like steel. I said, move on. Her hands didn't shake this time. The men weighed their odds, saw the fire in her eyes, the set of L.A. stance, and spat in the dirt before turning their horses. Ain't worth it, one muttered as they rode off. When the dust settled, Miriam lowered the shotgun, her shoulders trembling. Eli holstered his revolver, stepping closer. You did good, he said softly. She met his gaze, breath ragged. I thought my hands would give me away. They didn't. They saw a woman who wasn't about to bend. In that moment, something unspoken shifted between them. Not just gratitude, not just survival, but a bond forged under fire. That night, after Sarah was asleep, Miriam stood on the porch again, arms wrapped around herself. Eli leaned against the post, the lantern between them casting warm light across the dark. You should know, she said quietly. I never poisoned my husband. Hank, he drank himself mean, and one night the bottle took him before his fists could. But the town decided the story they liked better. Eli's jaw tightened, anger flaring not at her, but at a world that punished a woman for surviving. "You don't have to explain anything to me," he said. Her eyes glistened. "Maybe not, but I wanted you to know the truth, because you've given me something no one else has." "What's that?" "Belief. That I'm not the monster they say." Eli stepped closer, his voice low. "You're not. You're stronger than any of them put together." And for the first time, Miriam let herself lean just slightly into the space between them, as if the walls she'd built could stand a moment's rest. The storm that had been brewing in Dry Creek didn't come with thunder or rain. It came with whispers, sharpened into daggers by tongues too quick to judge Dot by the second month of Eli's steady presence at the Harper homestead. The town could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. He was seen hauling lumber, carrying flour sacks, even fixing fence posts alongside Miriam like a man already bound to her. To the good church folk of Dry Creek, that was more scandalous than a saloon brawl. It started in the churchyard one. Sunday morning. Miriam had begun taking Sarah again, wanting her daughter to know hymns and scripture, even if it meant enduring stares that could cut glass. They sat alone on the back pew, heads bowed, Sarah humming tunelessly to herself. Eli came in late, dust still on his boots, and without hesitation slid onto the pew beside them. The entire congregation went stiff. Mrs. Martha Caro, who prided herself on having a nose for sin, sniffed loudly. "Well," she whispered to her neighbor, "it seems scandal doesn't even wait outside God's house anymore." Reverend Powell cleared his throat awkwardly before starting the service. His sermon that day wandered into territory about the appearance of impropriety and temptation dressed as virtue, words that didn't name Miriam but might as well have. Eli sat stone-faced, fists clenched on his knees. Miriam's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high, eyes fixed on the worn hymn book in her lap. When the service ended, Sarah tugged her hand. "Mama, why were they looking at us like that?" Miriam swallowed hard, her voice low but steady. "Because sometimes people choose to see shadows instead of light, baby girl. But you don't let their shadows touch you." Eli heard, and something in his chest tightened admiration mixed with a fury he kept barely leashed. That afternoon, he rode out to the edge of town where the saloon spilled drunken laughter into the street. Inside, he found the usual knot of ranchers and loafers, men who spent more time with whiskey than work. "Rollins," one slurred as Eli pushed through. "How's the Poison Widow taste?" The room erupted with mean laughter. Eli's hand twitched near his holster, but he forced it still. Instead, he crossed the floor slow and deliberate until the laughter faltered. "You got something to say about a woman raising her child. You can say it to me sober." "In daylight," he said evenly. The drunk sneered, emboldened by his audience. "I'll say it plain. You're wasting yourself on a woman who should have been run out years ago. Some of us think it's time we reminded her." The implication hung heavy. Eli's blood went cold. "You so much as step foot on her land, you'll answer to me," he said, voice like gravel. He turned and left before fists could fly. But the warning had been given. That night, Miriam found him pacing the yard like a caged wolf. "What happened?" she asked, coming out onto the porch. "Men talking big in town. Talking about running you out." Her face went pale, but she didn't flinch. "They've threatened before. This was different," Eli muttered. More bite behind it. "I won't let them touch you, Miriam." She studied him, her arms crossed tight. "That's the trouble, Eli. You talk like protecting me is your burden. But you don't understand what happens if you stand too close. They'll come after you, too. Then let 'em." "Don't say that so easy." Her voice cracked, sharp with fear. "I can't." She stopped, pressing a hand over her mouth as if the words might break her. "Can't what?" he asked gently, stepping closer. Her eyes shimmered in the lantern light. Can't lose the only person who's stood by me since Hank's grave. Not when Sarah's finally laughing again. Not when I'm finally remembering what it feels like to breathe without a weight on my chest. Eli reached for her hand, rough palm closing over her trembling fingers. Then you're not going to lose me. But Dry Creek was not content to let them be. 2 nights later, rocks shattered the Harper window. Sarah screamed, Miriam clutching her to her chest. Eli was already outside, revolver drawn, but the riders were shadows against the moon, too quick and too many to chase. He returned to find Miriam sweeping glass from the floor, her jaw set like stone. See, she said bitterly, this is what your loyalty buys. No, Eli said firmly. This is what their fear buys. They see you standing tall, see you refusing to break, and it scares the hell out of them. She met his eyes, a storm raging in her own. And what happens the night they don't just throw rocks? Eli's voice dropped. Then they'll find I'm not a man who throws back pebbles. I'll end it if I have to. The next morning, Miriam saddled her mule. I'm going into town, she announced. Eli frowned. It's not safe. Her chin lifted. And hiding makes it worse. If I show fear, they'll smell it. Sarah and I have lived in shadows long enough. He didn't argue, though every nerve in his body wanted to. Instead, he rode beside her, silent, watchful. When they reached Main Street, heads turned like sunflowers to the sun. Miriam dismounted slow, every movement deliberate, and walked into Morrison's store with Sarah at her side. The room fell silent. Morrison himself stood stiff behind the counter. Mrs. Harper, he said coldly, didn't expect you'd be bold enough to show your face. Miriam met his gaze head-on. I'm here for flour, sugar, and coffee. Nothing more. You think folks will just pretend you're respectable? I don't need pretense, she replied calmly. Respect is earned, and I've earned mine 100 times over. The silence was thick. Then Sarah, brave as her mother, piped up. Mama makes the best biscuits in Dry Creek. You just don't know it. A laugh broke from the back of the store, an older ranch hand who'd seen enough cruelty in his life to know truth when he heard it. Slowly, the tension cracked. A few women shuffled, embarrassed by their own harsh whispers. Morrison scowled but rang up the order. Miriam paid in coin that clinked bright and clean against the counter as she left. Eli caught the flicker in her eyes, not triumph, not yet, but the spark of a woman reclaiming ground stolen from her. That night, on the porch, Miriam sat with Sarah asleep against her lap, lantern light painting her profile soft against the dark. Eli leaned on the rail, studying her in silence. You changed something today, he said quietly. I only bought flour. No, he murmured. You showed them you're not leaving. That matters. Her gaze flicked to him, and for the first time, she didn't look away. And if they keep pushing? Eli's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then they'll find out what happens when a man who's lost everything decides something's finally worth fighting for. And in the hush that followed, Miriam realized she wasn't afraid anymore, not of rocks or whispers, or the shadows of her past, because for the first time since Hank's death, she wasn't standing alone. The days after Miriam's bold step into town didn't bring peace. They brought tension wound tighter than a fence wire stretched too far. Dry Creek was a place where grudges grew faster than crops, and Miriam Harper's defiance had stirred something restless. Eli felt it every time he rode in. For supplies, the silence that fell when he entered the saloon, the stares that followed him down the boardwalk, the muttered words he could almost hear, but not quite. Trouble was coming, and it was only a matter of when. Not if. It started with small things. One morning, Miriam found their water barrel tipped and drained. the earth muddy with waste. Another day, Sarah's doll went missing from the porch, only to be found hanging from a fence post down the road with its head torn clean off. Sarah cried herself to sleep that night, clutching the broken toy. Eli fixed it the best he could, stitching the head back on with thick thread. But when he handed it back to the girl, her eyes were wary. "They don't like us, do they, Mr. Eli?" Eli crouched down, meeting her gaze. "Some folks don't like what they don't understand, Sarah, but you listen to me. You and your mama are worth more than all their gossip and tricks." Sarah's lip trembled, but she nodded. Miriam was harder to comfort. That night, as she swept the porch, she spoke without looking at him. "You should go back to your own place, Eli. This isn't your fight." He leaned against the rail, arms crossed. "It became mine the minute I stepped onto this land." She shook her head, her braids swinging loose. "You've lost friends in town, work, a name that mattered. All because of me. Because of you," he said firmly. "I've found something better than any name I had in town. I've found a reason to stand my ground." Her hands stilled on the broom. She turned, eyes flashing, half anger, half something softer. "Why? Why risk yourself for me?" Eli stepped closer, voice low but steady. "Because you deserve someone who believes in you. And because I can't walk away from you, Miriam. Not anymore." The air between them was charged, thick with everything unsaid. Miriam's breath caught, but before either could speak, the sound of hooves shattered the moment. 4 riders appeared at the edge of the yard, faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. Miriam's blood ran cold. Eli moved without hesitation, his hand on his revolver, body angled between her and the intruders. The leader dismounted, a lanky man with a cruel smile. "Evenin', Mrs. Harper," he drawled. "We hear tell you've been poisoning more than stew lately, poisoning the minds of decent folks. Time we reminded you where your place is." Eli's revolver gleamed in the lantern light. "Her place is right here, in her home. You boys best ride on before you regret planting your boots on this land." The men chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it. Big words from a man already half ruined. "You siding with her, Rollins? You'd best think on it. This town don't take kindly to outsiders mixing with." He sneered. "Women like her." Miriam's stomach twisted, but before she could speak, Eli's voice cut sharp. "I've thought on it. I stand with her. Now get off this property." The riders hesitated, reading the steel in his stance, the fire in Miriam's eyes, as she stepped onto the porch with her shotgun cradled firm. Finally, the leader spat in the dirt. "This ain't over." They mounted up and rode off into the dark. When the hoofbeats faded, Miriam's hands shook as she set the shotgun down. "You've painted a target on yourself," she whispered. Eli holstered his revolver and turned to her. "Then let him come for me instead of you?" Her eyes glistened, tears catching in the lamplight. "I don't want them to come for either of us." For a long moment they stood inches apart, the storm outside replaced by the storm inside them. Miriam raised a hand, hesitating, then let it rest against his chest. His heart thundered beneath her palm. "I don't know what this is, Eli," she said softly, "but I know it's the only thing that feels steady in a world set against me." He covered her hand with his own, rough and warm. "It's steady because it's real, Miriam, and I'll fight for it." The next morning brought more than just daylight. It brought a choice. Eli saddled his horse, jaw tight. "I need to go into town." Face them head on. Miriam gripped the porch rail, fear and pride warring in her chest. "If you go, they'll bait you into a fight, and I'll finish it." "Eli," he turned back, his eyes softer now. "Miriam, they're not just after you anymore. They're after us. Hiding won't change that. Standing will." Her throat tightened. She wanted to beg him not to go, but she knew he was right. So instead, she whispered, "Come back to me." He nodded once, then rode off toward town. Dry Creek was restless that day. Men lounged on the boardwalk, waiting for a show. Morrison stood outside his store, arms folded, watching Eli ride in with thinly veiled satisfaction. Eli dismounted, tied his horse, and walked straight into the saloon. The room went quiet, every eye fixed on him. The lanky rider from the night before rose from a corner table, smirking. "Well, if it ain't the widow's night." Eli's voice was calm, but it carried like thunder. "I've got something to say, and I want every man here to hear it. Miriam Harper is no poisoner, no shadow. She's a woman raising a daughter and standing stronger than most of you ever will. And if any man thinks to threaten her again, he'll answer to me." The saloon was dead silent. The lanky rider sneered. "You talk big, Rollins, but you're just one man." Eli's hand rested lightly near his revolver. "One man's enough." The standoff stretched, tension thick as smoke. Finally, the rider looked away, muttering under his breath. The crowd shifted uneasy. Not all agreed, but not all wanted to test Eli's resolve either. Eli turned and walked out. Shoulders square, his shadow long in the afternoon sun out back at the Harper homestead. Miriam waited on the porch, nerves stretched to breaking. When Eli rode up, dusty but alive, her breath left her in a rush. He dismounted, and before she could think, she was in his arms. Clutching him tight, he held her close, murmuring into her hair, "It's not done, but they know where we stand." She pulled back, her eyes searching his. "Where we stand?" He cupped her face in his rough hand, thumb brushing her cheek. "Together, Miriam. That's where I stand." And before she could speak, before she could doubt, his lips found hers firm, steady, carrying all the promises he hadn't yet spoken aloud. For the first time in years, Miriam Harper didn't feel alone. She felt chosen. The kiss lingered like fire in Miriam's chest, long after Eli pulled away. She wanted to scold him, to warn him again about the danger, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with the warmth of being seen, defended, chosen. For a moment, the world was quiet. But quiet never lasted long in Dry Creek. The trouble began 2 days later. Eli was fixing the corral fence when the sound of galloping hooves split the still air. He turned just as Sarah came running from the porch, pointing. "Riders, Mama." "3 of them." Miriam appeared in the doorway, her apron still dusted with flour. Fear flickered across her face, but she didn't move back. She'd learned too well that hiding solved nothing. The men reined up hard at the fence line, dust rising around them. Eli recognized them immediately. Tom Garrett, Pike Stevens, and another ranch hand whose face was meaner than a rattlesnake's. Garrett leaned forward in his saddle, a sneer twisting his mouth. "Afternoon, Rollins. Looks like you didn't take the sheriff's advice about appearances." Eli set his hammer down, straightened to his full height, and rested one hand on the fence. His revolver hung heavy at his side, but he didn't reach for it. "Not yet. Afternoon, Garrett. You boys here to lend a hand? We could use some honest labor instead of gossip." Pike spat into the dirt. "We ain't here for jokes. We're here to warn you. You keep on with this charity case, and you'll find yourself run clean out of Dry Creek." Miriam's hands gripped the porch rail tight enough to whiten her knuckles. Eli's voice, when it came, was calm as a still pond. "Funny thing about running a man out of town, he's got to be willing to run." "And I don't run." The ranch hand snarled. "Maybe we ought to teach you how." Eli's hand hovered near his revolver now, and the 3 riders stiffened. For a breathless moment, the yard was nothing but heat, dust, and the promise of violence. Then Sarah's voice broke through. "Leave us alone." The little girl stood at the edge of the porch, her doll clutched tight. Her chin trembled, but her eyes, Miriam's eyes, blazed with defiance. Garrett shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath. Pike spat again. "This ain't over, Rollins. You'll regret siding with her." They yanked their reins and wheeled their horses away, hooves pounding a retreat that promised return out inside. Miriam trembled as she poured Eli a cup of coffee. He sat at the table, silent, jaw tight. "They'll kill you, Eli," she whispered. I saw it in their eyes. He looked up, his gaze steady. "And let them try. But I won't walk away from you." Her throat tightened. "Why can't you just let me bear this alone? Why drag yourself into my shame?" "Because it was never your shame to bear," he said softly. "It's theirs. And I'll carry that fight, Miriam, gladly." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're a fool." "Maybe," he admitted. "But I'm your fool." The words stole her breath, leaving her heart unguarded. She wanted to argue, but Sarah climbed into Eli's lap just then, curling against him as if he were already hers. And Miriam couldn't bring herself to break the moment. The next week was uneasy calm. Eli kept working the ranch, though he wore his revolver like a second skin now. Miriam cooked, cleaned, and tended the garden, her movements sharper, more watchful. Sarah sensed the tension, but filled the silence with chatter, asking Eli endless questions about horses, crops, and the stars overhead. It was almost peaceful until Saturday night. The fire was low, the lamps dim, when a crash shattered the stillness. Glass sprayed across the floor as a rock hurled through the window, landing inches from Sarah's doll. Miriam screamed. Eli was already moving. He grabbed his rifle from the rack, kicked the door open, and strode into the night. Shadows flickered at the edge of the yard. 3, maybe 4 figures, running toward their horses. Eli fired a warning shot into the air, his voice thundering across the darkness. "You come back here and face me, you cowards." The only answer was the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. Miriam stood in the doorway, Sarah clinging to her skirts, tears streaking her cheeks. Eli lowered the rifle, his chest heaving with fury. "This ends now," he growled. "No more warnings. No more hiding." The next morning, Eli saddled his horse with grim determination. Miriam caught his arm. "Where are you going?" "To the sheriff. To Garrett. To whoever needs telling. They're not breaking another window, not while I'm breathing." Her eyes burned with fear and pride all at once. "Then I'm coming with you?" He shook his head. "Miriam, no," she said firmly, her hand steady on his sleeve. "I won't hide in the shadows anymore. If they want to shame me, let them say it to my face." For a moment, Eli searched her eyes, then nodded. "All right, but stay close." Together, they rode into Dry Creek. The town was alive with Saturday bustle wagons rattling, children running, men loitering in doorways. But when Eli and Miriam rode in side by side, the noise dimmed to a hush. Morrison stood on his store porch, arms folded, lips pursed like he'd been sucking lemons. The saloon doors swung open, and out came Tom Garrett with Pike Stevens at his side. "Well, look here," Garrett drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The poison widow and her gallant knight." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Miriam's chin lifted, her spine straight as steel. Eli dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate. "You threw a rock at a child last night," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "That ends today." Garrett smirked. "And what if it doesn't?" Eli's hand rested near his revolver. "Then I end it." The crowd shifted, whispers swelling like storm wind. The sheriff pushed his way through then, his hat low, eyes wary. "Enough." Watson barked. This town's had its fill of brawls. Garrett, Stevens, you cross that line again, and I'll lock you up. Garrett spat, but he backed off a step. This ain't over, Rollins. No, Eli agreed coldly. It isn't. Back at the ranch that evening, Miriam sat on the porch, Sarah asleep inside. Eli leaned against the rail, silent. You've made enemies, she said quietly. I've had enemies before. They'll come for you. Eli, for us. He turned to her, his expression fierce, almost tender. Then let them come. I've fought storms, rustlers, and worse. But I'll fight harder for you than for anything else. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. Why me? Because you're worth it, he said simply. And because somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting for your safety and started fighting for your heart. Her breath caught, and for a moment the world seemed to still the cicadas' quiet, the stars above holding their breath. Miriam Harker knew then that no matter what storm was coming, she wasn't facing it alone. The night came heavy, thick with the smell of dust and heat that never broke even after sunset. Eli sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon. Something in his gut told him the storm he'd been waiting for wasn't far, inside. Miriam put Sarah to bed, singing low, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. When she came out, lantern light spilling across her face, she paused at the door. You haven't slept in days, she murmured. Sleep's a luxury, Eli replied without looking away from the dark. Men like Garrett don't forget. They bide their time. Her arms crossed tight against her chest. And when they come? Eli's jaw tightened. Then I'll be ready. It didn't take long. Just after midnight, the horses stirred, snorting uneasily. Eli was on his feet in a breath, lantern snuffed, rifle raised. From the tree line came the low thud of hooves. Shadows moved 5, 6 riders, maybe more. Stay inside, Eli whispered. But Miriam stepped onto the porch beside him, shotgun gripped firm. I'm not hiding, she said fiercely. He didn't argue. Together, they waited. The riders emerged into the clearing, their torches painting the yard in flickering orange. Garrett was at the front, grinning wide. Well, well, the widow's night really does keep watch. Eli leveled his rifle. Last warning, Garrett. You turn around and ride out. Nobody gets hurt. Laughter rippled through the men. Pike leaned forward in his saddle. You think you can stand against all of us? Try me, Eli said flatly. For a heartbeat, the standoff held tension strung tight as a bowstring. Then one of the riders hurled his torch toward the barn. The dry hay caught fast, flames licking up into the night. Sarah's scream pierced the air. Eli fired, the crack of his rifle splitting the chaos. One rider tumbled from his horse with a cry. The yard erupted gunfire, shouts, the roar of fire. Horses reared, smoke billowed. Miriam fired the shotgun, the blast deafening, scattering the men closest to the porch. Eli dropped his rifle for his revolver, moving like a man carved from the fight itself. Every shot was deliberate, measured. He wasn't a man drunk on rage. He was cold, precise, protecting what was his. Garrett's voice rang above the chaos. Drag him out. He's one man, take him. But Eli wasn't alone. Miriam reloaded with steady hands, firing again, forcing the riders back. The flames from the barn lit her face, fierce and unflinching. Sarah clutched the doorway, eyes wide but dry, watching her mother stand like iron. The fight stretched long minutes, but the tide turned when one rider slumped from his horse, groaning, and another bolted, spooked by the flames. The rest wavered, eyes flicking to Garrett for orders. Garrett cursed, fury twisting his features. Cowards. It's one man and a widow. 2, Eli corrected, stepping forward, revolver trained steady. And there enough. Something in his voice, solid, unyielding, broke the rider's nerve. One by one, they wheeled their horses and fled into the dark, leaving Garrett and Pike alone. Smoke choked the yard, the barn a collapsing inferno. Garrett raised his gun, rage boiling, but Miriam's shotgun fired first. The blast tore the pistol from his hand, sending him sprawling. Pike froze, pale in the firelight. Eli's revolver never wavered. "Go," he said coldly, "and tell the town what you saw tonight, that this family won't bend." Pike didn't argue. He scrambled onto his horse and vanished into the night. Garrett staggered up, clutching his bleeding hand, hate burning in his eyes. "This ain't over, Rollins. You'll regret crossing me." Eli stepped close. Merrill pressed against Garrett's chest. "No, you will." For a long moment, it seemed Eli might pull the trigger. But at last he stepped back. "Get out of my sight." Garrett mounted clumsily and rode off, leaving the yard littered with smoke, embers, and the echo of violence. When the flames finally died, only blackened timbers remained of the barn. Miriam stood staring, her shotgun loose at her side, shoulders trembling. "You've lost your barn," she whispered. Eli holstered his revolver, stepped closer, and gently lifted the shotgun from her hands. "It's wood and nails. What matters is still standing." Her eyes glistened. "They won't stop, Eli, even after tonight." "Then neither will I," he said firmly. "Let them come back. Let the whole damn town come. I'll stand as long as it takes." Something broke loose in her then, fear, pride, the walls she'd built around herself. She sagged against him, his arms wrapping around her tight. "You don't have to stand alone anymore," Eli murmured. She clung to him, silent tears falling. For the first time in years, Miriam Harper let herself lean. The next morning, the yard was quiet but heavy with smoke and ash. Sarah played near the porch, humming softly, as if determined to stitch normalcy back into the broken night. Miriam and Eli sat side by side on the steps, exhaustion etched deep in their faces. "Word will spread," Miriam said at last. "By sundown, everyone in Dry Creek will know what happened here." Eli nodded. "Good. Let them know. Let them understand you're not some shadow they can push around. You're a woman who stood her ground, and you didn't break." Her eyes met his, searching. "And you? What happens when the law decides you went too far?" "Then I'll face it," Eli said simply. "But I'll face it with you." Miriam's lips trembled, but this time it wasn't from fear. "You talk like you mean to stay, Eli Rollins." "I do," he said quietly. "If you'll have me." The words hung between them, fragile and fierce all at once. And though she didn't answer yet, Miriam's hand found his, fingers lacing tight. It was answer enough. The smoke had barely cleared from the blackened ruin of the barn when the sheriff rode in. Sheriff Watson wasn't a man easily rattled, but his eyes widened at the sight of charred timbers, the scorched earth, and the grim determination in Eli's stance on the porch. Miriam stood beside him, her shotgun still leaning against the rail, Sarah clinging to her skirts. "Sweet mercy," Watson muttered as he dismounted. "What in hell happened here?" "Ask Garrett," Eli said flatly. His voice was hoarse from smoke, but steady as stone. "Him and his boys set fire to the barn. Came with guns and torches. If we hadn't fought them off, you'd be looking at 3 bodies instead of 1 building." Watson looked hard at Eli, then at Miriam. "And you fired back?" Miriam's chin lifted. "We defended ourselves." The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, weariness written across his face. "Town's in an uproar. Half of them say you brought this on yourselves. The other half think Garrett's gone too far. I can't jail a whole damn street full of men, but I can make sure no one crosses this property again. Words won't stop men like Garrett, Eli replied. He's tasted blood. He'll be back. Watson met his gaze and saw the truth there. He sighed. I'll do what I can, Rollins. But you'd best be ready. This ain't done. By sundown, word had spread through Dry Creek like wildfire. Folks gathered in the saloon, in Morrison's store, even in the churchyard, voices clashing, some condemning, some defending. She brought this on herself, Martha Carroll hissed. Any decent woman would have left after her husband's disgrace. You didn't see her stand, an old ranch hand countered. She faced down 6 men with a shotgun, steady as iron. That's more backbone than half the men in this town. And at the center of it all, Garrett nursed his bandaged hand, his pride bleeding louder than the wound. This ain't finished, he growled. That rancher and his witch think they can spit on us? We'll show them who runs Dry Creek. But for the first time, not everyone nodded. Some turned away, uneasy. Fear of Garrett's rage was giving way to respect for Miriam's defiance, and for Eli's unshakable loyalty. Back at the Harper homestead, the night was quiet save for the crackle of the fire. Sarah slept soundly for the first time in days. Exhausted by fear and relief, Miriam sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. Eli leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze never leaving her. You're not saying it, she murmured at last. Saying what? That I should leave. That Sarah and I should run before Garrett makes good on his threats. Eli pushed away from the wall, coming to stand before her. His shadow stretched long in the lamplight. Because I don't believe it. Running won't end this. Garrett's hate don't stop at your fence line. If you leave, he'll chase you down until he's satisfied. Only way it ends is if we face him here. Miriam's throat tightened. And if it kills you? He crouched, taking her hands in his rough ones. Then I die, knowing I stood for something worth the fight. Miriam, I've spent years alone, building fences, mending barns, keeping to myself like it was enough. But it wasn't. Not till I found you. Don't you see? You and Sarah, you're the home I didn't know I was missing. Tears blurred her vision. You talk like a man already decided. I am, Eli said softly. I love you, Miriam. And I'll say it plain, whether the whole town hears or not. For a long heartbeat, silence filled the room, broken only by the pop of firewood. Then Miriam leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. I swore I'd never let another man close. Not after Hank, but you. Her voice broke. You've given me hope again. And I love you too. The words, fragile and fierce, sealed something no fire or gossip could burn away. The final test came 3 nights later. Garrett returned, drunk on whiskey and vengeance, dragging 2 men with him. They rode hard into the yard, shouting, firing shots into the air. Eli was already outside, revolver drawn, when Miriam joined him on the porch. She didn't hide behind him this time. She stood at his side, shotgun raised. This is your last chance, Garrett, Eli called. Leave or I'll put you in the ground. Garrett laughed, bitter and broken. You think the town will forgive you for killing me? They'll string you up beside her. Miriam's voice cut sharp. Then let them see the truth, that you're nothing but a coward who torches barns and terrorizes women. For the first time, doubt flickered in Garrett's eyes. His men shifted uneasily, not eager to die for his pride. One muttered, "He ain't worth it," and spurred his horse away. The other followed. Garrett cursed, rage spilling out of him. He raised his gun too slow. Eli's shot rang true, sending the pistol spinning from his hand. Garrett howled, clutching his wrist, before falling hard into the dirt. Eli stood over him, revolver steady. You've done your worst, Garrett, and you lost. You come back here again. You won't leave. Garrett looked up, hatred burning, but he saw Miriam standing fierce, Eli unyielding, and realized Dry Creek was no longer his to bully. He stumbled to his horse and rode off into the night. Defeated. Dawn came soft and quiet. The barn was gone, but peace settled over the homestead like a fragile blanket. Miriam stood in the yard, watching Sarah chase butterflies, her laughter bright against the morning. Eli joined her, his hand brushing hers. "It's over," he said quietly. "For now," she agreed. Then she looked at him, her eyes steady. "But whatever comes, I'm not afraid anymore. Not with you beside me." He smiled, rare and real. "Then let's build something worth all the fighting, together." Her fingers twined with his, and in that simple gesture was a vow deeper than any spoken words. Weeks later, Dry Creek buzzed with new whispers. Not of scandal, but of resilience. Folks came to trade with Miriam again, some with heads bowed in apology, others with cautious respect. Sarah skipped through the aisles, proud to be the daughter of the strongest woman in town. And when Eli Rollins rode by her side, no one dared call it shame anymore. They called it what it was, a Western love story, written in fire, steel, and the quiet strength of two hearts that had found refuge in each other.